so really thinking about how all these different realms intersect. And I was trying to think, what is it that distinguishes CMS work? And I've just got 3 points that this is from my perspective. And I think the first one is that military power is a question. It's a question rather than something that's natural or inevitable. So the starting point is always to interrogate it as a social phenomenon, as a way of organizing society, as a way of responding to problems and issues. A second aspect, I think, of CMS work has been to rethink taken for granted categories that we often have. So to look again at militaries and the things we associate with militarism and militarization, and actually examine, is there a different way of thinking about this? Are there other threads we could look at to interrogate this in a different way? And then I think another key characteristic of much CMS work, though not all of it, is the engaged nature of it, in the sense that CMS scholars aren't afraid to talk to people closest to the military institution. They're happy to talk to veterans, people who are serving, but also sometimes work with military affiliated organizations and really embrace those tensions that arise. Okay, so it's about critically engaging with those institutions. So that's sort of my summary, I think, of what CMS is, and other people might have different views. So that's where this special issue is situated within that sort of set of debates. And the special issue we're talking about today is called Voices of Veteran Researchers. And we deliberately wanted to make sure it was voices and not voice, because we were sort of really keen to express the plurality of veterans' experiences and their voices and the type of research that they do. But essentially, the special issue invited the authors to think about what reflective labour they need to do to engage critically with their experiences in their academic work, and to really think about positionality, reflexivity, and what it is about their experience in the military and how it informs their work that they do as a researcher. And then importantly, I suppose, particularly for a CMS kind of audience, is what new knowledge might these veteran researchers be able to give us about militaries and their power? So there's that sort of broader question as well. And veterans' voices are seen as, I think, a very interesting area to look at, because they're often some of the most privileged, but also the most marginalized. They are highly mediatized. We often think we have an idea of what a veteran is and what a veteran will say, because of the media and war films and military literature. And so in some ways, there are a lot of highly publicized veteran voices. They're often celebrated as offering, in Joanna Tidy's words, a ground truth about what war is really like. But equally, they can be criticised as focusing on, for example, Western agents of violence and their pain, or they can be criticised as being, well, they're militarised. So what can we learn from them, because they've been inculcated into this institution? So we know what they're going to say before they say it. And so veterans' voices in general, we wanted to explore. And we wanted to explore that in terms of how veterans can think about their experience and how that informs their research in this special issue. So I will hand over to Nick, who is going to sort of continue the intro and then manage the Q&A. Oh, and I should say, I'm going to be watching the chat. So if there's questions at any point, feel free to write them in, and then I will interject at various points to make sure they get asked, or there'll be the opportunity to put your hand up. Anyway, over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Caddick. I'm Associate Professor of Political Sociology and Deputy Director of the Veterans and Families Institute at Anglia Ruskin University. I have co-edited this fantastic special issue of Critical Military Studies Journal on Voices of Veterans as Researchers. So I'll just say a little bit more in addition to what Sarah has already outlined there before we kind of launch in with the authors talking about their papers here. So one of our starting points, I guess, for this special issue is looking at the figure of the British veteran, or the veteran, sorry, the veteran in general, not just the British veteran, and looking at what kind of meanings are typically associated with the identity or the figure of the veteran. And really thinking that actually this is a veteran, the notion of a veteran is an identity or a subjectivity, a figure that is really over-determined with meaning from all sorts of different sources. So being a veteran can mean so many different things to so many different people. And it is, again, an identity, a subjectivity, a position, a figure that is open to so many different political uses. And that's really one of the intriguing aspects about work in this area. And within the critical military studies scholarly community, what this special issue is doing is picking up on a burgeoning kind of subfield of this work, if you like, looking at veterans issues and experiences internationally. And as Sarah mentioned, that is not restricted to by any means to Western veterans or even veterans in general. It's trying to think broader about how do these experiences intersect with other experiences of war and military life as well. So there's very much a strong thread of trying to unpick notions of criticality, positionality, and reflexivity in relation to veterans and veteran identities. And in this particular case, what are veterans turned academic researchers contributing to our knowledge base in this area? So we have a really exciting special issue that has been put together for Critical Military Studies Journal, which has just been released. I hope you've had a chance to engage with some of it so far. Some of you may have, some of you may have not yet had a chance to read the articles. If you haven't done, I very much encourage you to read the papers. They're an excellent series of papers that are really at the cutting edge of work in this field. And particular thanks to Hannah West and Sophie Antrobus, without whose coordination and determination and efforts, this special issue literally would not be happening. So very big congratulations to you two. I think that's all I need to say really in terms of my introduction to the special issue. I'm really pleased to have been a part of putting it together with the editorial team. We're going to hear from the authors in the special issue in the order of in the order that they appear within the special issue. So I will hand over in a second to Paul to kick us off with the discussion. But before I do, can I just please remind everybody, if you're not speaking, please mute your mic, mute your microphone so that we can minimize any background disruptions. As Sarah mentioned, she and I will be monitoring the chat and leading the Q&A discussion after each of our authors has presented. Each of our contributing authors has been asked to speak for 8 to 10 minutes. So we reserve the right to cut you off if you overrun. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Paul to kick us off with his paper. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So I just wanted to start, actually, I've heard the word fantastic a lot of times today. It's world beating. I'm getting close to that as well. But it's genuinely a really great initiative. So now I have a question really around my paper before we get the ball rolling. So there's been a lot happening with CMS in terms of contributions, and I have various things going on here. So the paper you want to hear from me to clarify is the one that is going to be presented at the RUS. Am I correct? Just to make sure I've got the exact right special issue in mind here. Is that right? So Sophie would know this, and Hannah too.
Yeah, looks like Sophie's typing, but I was expecting you to present the paper that was in the special issue, so the military. Oh,
right, okay. Right. So actually, I must admit I've slightly misstepped that one. I mean, I can present it, I can talk to it right now, that's fine. But can I just ask, perhaps I just go a little bit later on just to get my thoughts together, because I just realized then that this was not the right, this is another paper in preparation for CMS, so if that's okay.
No problem. I know the two are connected, Paul, and one.
Yeah. There's big overlaps, yeah, but maybe if that's possible, that'd be quite useful.
That's fine. Paul, so it's the paper on military pride that we're all really looking forward to hearing.
Yes, of course it is, I know.
Thank you.
Don't worry, you'll get plenty of that, but yeah, like I say, I'll just, if that's okay, to upset the running order a little bit, that'd be
great. Yeah, so if that's okay, Hannah and Sophie, you appear next in the running order. Would you be happy to?
No.
Okay, we'll come to you first. Thank you.
So this is the only co-authored paper of the group. So you're going to hear from Sophie and I speaking together. So when we're going to give you some extracts from the paper as well. But our paper is called Deeply Odd: Women Veterans as Critical Feminist Researchers. So to start with, just to tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a former naval. I'm a former naval air engineer, and I spent 2 years working out of branch with the Army, which included deploying to Helmand, and amongst other things during that time I worked on gender. And that was the spark to further study. And now my research looks at gender and military power in various sort of dimensions. And I guess I hadn't really appreciated at the time I started all that study what a kind of journey it would be from serving to becoming a critical researcher, and how much time I would need to give to working through what this meant to me and to my research. But quite early on in my PhD, I met Sophie, who was also doing PhD, and we got talking about our time in the military, and we kind of remembered things that we had normalized about our gendered experience of the military. And that's really where this paper came from. I'll hand to Sophie.
Yeah, so just to introduce myself, I'm Sophie Antrobus. I was in the Royal Air Force for 20 years, from 1991 to 2001. I joined initially as a pilot, so I was the 7th woman on flying training in the Air Force. I did leave partly because my political voice was clearly stifled by being not being allowed to be political while you're serving, and also due to the misogynistic behaviour of my final boss. I did take my politics further when I stood for Labour in the general election in 2015, and then I embarked on my PhD. I didn't win the election. My PhD was in air power and the creation of the RAF, and I now look at organisational culture and behaviour in the contemporary military. As Hannah said, we met early in our PhD and we started having conversations, and the paper that we're talking about today features a number of these conversations as part of it. So we thought we would take you through a couple of these conversations to frame parts of the paper. So Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah. So there was a small lockable cage on board for women's underwear. And I remember at the time thinking, well, at least they've thought of that. There's somewhere for us to hang them.
How nice of them.
Implying that they weren't going to be swiped by any men. But now, of course, I look back at it and think, why on earth did we need to lock away our underwear?
And if you left your camera at the bar when you went to the loo or were buying a drink or something, you get back, there'd be a camera that you'd have to go and develop in those days, not digital or anything like that. And then you go to the chemist or send them away to TruePrint or whatever. You get it back and there'd be a whole load of men's genitals, because they'd have taken pictures just because they thought it was hilarious. The guy who'd done it to me one time had left his wristwatch on. We managed to work out who it was and posted it on the notice board with his name and everything. But it wasn't because we were trying to get him into trouble. It was everyone thought it was funny, including us.
I totally remember someone who was bordering on hypothermia. He was not in a good way. We managed to get him in a dry sleeping bag. And yeah, I shared a sleeping bag with him just to get him warm. And again, that wasn't at all weird. But I remember telling my mum about it later and her not really understanding the context of it and her finding it really strange.
So there were things that we did and we look back and think, that was a sensible thing to do, but still seems odd from the outside. And then there were things that we don't really remember until we start talking about it that were deeply odd.
Yeah, really, really strange. So this is the first of the conversations that we opened the paper with. And these kind of emerged out of meeting at a number of sort of conferences early on in our PhDs. And I talked about this example of the underwear on the ship. And I think Sophie was listening along to this and thought, yeah, I know what you mean. And from there, you know, many conversations happened.
And so the term deeply odd actually came directly out of one of these conversations. And we were talking about, you know, how we were insiders in the military as well as simultaneously outsiders, because we were women. And our desire and need to conform in order to fit into an environment of militarized masculinity prevented us from seeing the deeply odd nature of our interactions, and indeed our very existence in that context. And by the way, by deeply odd, we mean deeply concerningly odd, not somewhat curious. In uncovering the deeply odd aspects of our past, we realised that this characterisation served as a critical device in explaining the sensation we have experienced in revisiting our times of remembering as we circle around our former lives.
We realised that there are many things we experienced when serving that we couldn't have seen at the time as problematic or discriminatory. It's taken critical distance or the fostering of a space to deconstruct and demilitarise our identities. But the military will always be a part of us, and there are certainly things for me that I still haven't completely processed. Having the reassurance of talking to someone else who got it and together through this, you know, went through the shock as we kind of revisited things that we pushed to the back of our minds and realised how deeply odd they were. And as we moved away from our military identities and took on new identities as critical scholars, we found that we were also sort of problematic in our new field as well, given our military pasts and the kind of historic relationship between feminism and pacifism.
And we've discussed quite a lot what we mean by sort of insider-outsider identity, because it applies to us both in our former lives and in our current lives, talking about our relative proximity. So we were insiders in the military, reticent to stand out, and that we were reticent to stand out any more than we already did as women in such male-dominated organisations. And of course, we really didn't think about campaigning for women's rights or better treatment in an institution that discouraged discussions of politics. So our complicity, though, hid, we think, an inner resistance that's only emerged once we reached a critical distance from our former lives. And this was during our PhD. And we mean that distance both physically, in terms of space, emotionally, and temporally. And yet now we find ourselves, and might want to come to this in questions, in a new insider-outsider identity. Are we true insiders in the CMS community, given our military backgrounds? And what about when we re-engage, as we both have done, with the military community? We're going to take you through another conversation to sort of bring us to a close with a few words at the end. So I'll kick off, and this is a bit about our journey to where we are now. The journey from veteran to researcher for me has been circular, from veteran to non-veteran to veteran again, but now as a subordinate of my but accepted element of my identity. I entered the academy keen to lose the label of veteran. For me, being ex-RAF had become a definition of what I wasn't anymore, rather than what I was. I subsequently found that I could engage again with contemporary military questions, but on different terms. When I was asked to write a Guardian opinion piece on a report into harassment and bullying in the military in the summer of 2019, I realised that if my veteran self had still been dominant, I would have rejected the opportunity as critical of colleagues, even though in this context, the criticism was deserved. While my subordinate veteran self was important to my ability to critique and understand this subject, my dominant reflexive researcher self was the self with the necessary confidence, motivation, and distance to write a critical piece that did not shy away from the reality of the problem within the services.
Being face to face with the military again to present my research, I knew I needed to sound credible to be heard. I had the advantage of being assumed to be one of them. I speak the same language of military jargon. I can introduce myself with familiar ranks, with experience of familiar operations, a former Navy Lieutenant Commander who deployed on Herrick 10. I want them to listen. I want them to hear what I have to say. And I feel a certain sense of being comfortable. I know what their expectations are of me, and I even feel a sense of loyalty to an organisation that was so formative to my development as a person. But I have this critical feminist perspective to convey. So standing up and saying I'm going to be critical, though, doesn't concern my audience. They're conversant with the use of lessons learned to inform policy. But when I start to ask questions about the nature of combat and soldiering and what it means for the gendered military institution, it's a different kind of critical. And getting back together with serving and sometimes former military friends can feel uncomfortable too when I get to describing my critical research. I feel that they will see me as disloyal to what we think of as our shared experience, and even disapproving of their ongoing service. It can be hard to describe the transition from the military to academy without sounding as though you think you know better, or that you have new insights that you couldn't see when serving, so neither will they. And this sense of loyalty to the military can be testing. I grew up in the military, it shaped who I am, and I struggle not to find myself talking about we when we talk about the armed forces. And yet these revelations about the gendered realities of service test how I negotiate memories of military service. I find myself struggling to reconcile the fulfilling and exciting formative experiences and amazing people with the uncomfortable reflections on the gendered institution.
Thinking about my behaviours and those of my peers, friends, subordinates and commanders is complicated because I can see that I was complicit in the institution which sanctioned or ignored them. The line between what I always saw as unacceptable behaviour, assault, groping, discrimination in career progression, and what I only later come to see as unacceptable, banter, patronising attitudes to gender equality and towards women, is hazy when I try and articulate it. In reviewing my military experience critically, I'm self-conscious both of the potential for condescension in my attitude and for the accusation of hypocrisy. Stepping away from the institutionalized mindset of the military and into a role as a critical researcher has been liberating, but also awkward. I'm definitely an outsider from the military complex, but my ex-military status can distance me from the CMS community. I'm developing a different way of thinking and behaving, but perhaps I'm still an outsider here. So I'm aware that we're just about at 10 minutes, so we'll wrap up now. I mean, this paper has taken us quite a long way. Since we first put it together, we've had submitted parts of it as evidence to the Women in Armed Forces review for the Parliament, the House Commons Defence Committee did, and we've talked about it a lot, so we'd be happy to answer any questions. Hannah, over to you to close.
Yeah, just a couple of final points. So these conversations have helped me and I know Sophie to reflect on our relationship between, you know, having been a servicewoman and military power, and they've been fundamental to our thinking about our own positionality. They certainly contributed to my own decision to weave my own story through my thesis in the first person. And I think I continue to grapple with these questions of proximity to the military in my research, feeling committed to engaging, but also wanting to do so in a critical and radical way. And I think maybe to close on the note of, just the term veteran itself, as we've mentioned a number of times in what we've talked about, and obviously came up in the introduction. I started off always calling myself ex-military. I wasn't really comfortable with the term veteran, but I think I kind of lapsed into this because it's well understood, and so I've kind of started to use that. But I think more recently I'm trying to actually revert back to ex-military as a term I'm happier with. The label veteran to me still doesn't conjure up someone like me, and I think we'll close on that.
Thank you very much, Hannah and Sophie. So we're going to move to our next speaker, Neil, in just a second. So we're going to take questions at the end of all of the speakers, and we are happy with questions that are addressed to the panel as a whole, or specific questions to any of the paper authors. So we're going to move next to Neil, please.
Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Thanks to everybody for organising this, and of course for organising the journal itself. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we could hear you.
Can you see me? Because you've just disappeared off my screen, but that doesn't matter.
Yeah, we can hear and see you. Okay,
right. I've lost vision, so instead of playing with the computer, I'll just go ahead and pretend you can see us. Okay. So the paper I'm going to talk about is the one called "Critical Veteran Researchers' Unique Adequacy: Accounting for Friendly Fire and Fratricide." Now, I'll just give you a quick background to this because it is a personal paper which took me. I've been working on for a number of years in various guises and have numerous versions of. And basically, I was in the Royal Marines. I served in Northern Ireland and the Falklands. I then left the Royal Marines, became a sociologist, focusing on social legal studies and then medical decision making. But I was trained as an ethnomethodologist, and ethnomethodology being a form of what we might think of ethnographic studies. And this paper comes as a sort of my reflections on what, as a veteran, I bring to critical military studies and what other veterans bring to critical military studies, using my own case as an example of how that can be specifically applied in specific instances, according to what ethnomethodologists call unique adequacy requirement of methods. I'll explain that in a second. But first, I'll just give a quick outline of the paper to get everybody on board. I'll just read this, it'll be simpler. The paper first broadly outlines the ethnomethodological topic of unique adequacy, which is set out full of critical military studies by me in 2018. Friendly fire and fratricide are then introduced, followed by accounts of these in formal analytic accounts of combat identification analysis, which what I would do was a sort of ethnomethodological respecification of those, and then I discuss them in non-critical analysis of military memoirs involving soldiers' own accounts of friendly fire incidents. And I do a respecification of that as a general thing, although the paper doesn't focus on respecification in a big way because it isn't an ethnomethodological paper per se. It's about critical military studies research and undertaking that as a veteran. as you'd expect for the special edition. It's a critical analysis using an approach drawing on critical veteran researchers' unique adequacy is then undertaken of a formal account of a military campaign history of friendly fire and fratricide incident. This is an incident from the Falklands where both the formal account given in the form of formal military history is one in which I happen to be there, so I can contrast my understandings of it as a critical military researcher with those of the formal military history account produced by an officer who was then serving with the Royal Marines at the time. This event is taken as a perspicuous example for heuristic analysis where a critical veteran researcher's members' knowledge in the form of their unique adequacy to undertake research can usefully be applied to critically analyze the absences within formal and normalizing accounts, illustrating what has been left out and illustrating how potential topics for further critical analysis emerge from the ability of the critical military researcher veteran to use their own unique adequacy in the analytic framework which they devised to look at the phenomena, in this case, formal accounts of fratricide. Okay, that's a lot to digest to start off with. So the first thing I should do really is introduce what unique adequacy is. And basically, unique adequacy is a term devised by Harold Garfinkel, founder of Ethnographic Methodology, by which there's a requirement of ethnographic studies undertaken by ethnomethodologists for them to have some form of competences in the study area in which they're investigating. And so if famously, if you were going to study mathematics, you would train as a mathematician and then be both an ethnomethodologist and a mathematician studying mathematics. Okay, so you get the general gist of it, but you don't have to be studying mathematics. You could be studying football, you could be studying anything. Ethnomethodologists study everything, and some of these skills are generic skills which we have. They're not all highly specialized skills. So you could study people ordering beer at a bar, or example, skills which we all share in common. So there's diversity of the types of skills which we'll be talking about, but members have these skills, researchers have them, and they should utilize them where they have them to investigate the phenomena of interest. Okay, and the key point of this is it facilitates them in making decisions in collaboration with others, not just by themselves, others who don't necessarily have the same shared experiences, in this case military, and designing research which captures the phenomena which they're intending to look at. So what you have is, if you have an understanding of the phenomena and you have an understanding of the different types of research methods, you can then combine the two to devise a research methodology which adequately captures the phenomena you're interested in this case, fratricide for me, without ironicizing that phenomena. Okay. However, the caveat being, of course, that's an ethnomethodological requirement to have the unique adequacy. It's not a critical military studies requirement to have that unique adequacy. And what I'm doing here is not saying that critical military studies should have that, need to have that unique adequacy. But what it is that veteran researchers may have unique adequacy of certain phenomena they're going to research at, and they can use that as a resource for designing research methods and for having insight into the analysis of the data which they collect, informed by that unique adequacy, which will then give them insights which they collaboratively produce with other members of the research team, not just themselves, in understanding the phenomena in a much more rounded and grounded and reflexive fashion, and which they can then see phenomena and topics of interest which can be taken further. Okay, so There's a lot to go on with there. In this paper, what I do is I look at two areas of research, formal normative types of research, very different ones. One is the combat identification analysis, whereby fratricides are usually analyzed by looking for things which went wrong for the improvement of the military machine. And usually what happens is the members themselves, the people who were involved in this, and their afterlives of the events are left out of the analysis. And I critique that and say that this is a problem, and critical military research can look at this with great insight, and it needs to do to understand the nature of militarism in society and its effect on individuals and groups and families and everybody involved, which is very large, which I go into in the paper. The second area I look at is to the memoirs accounts, which is where you might think that military veterans themselves write about their experiences of being in fratricide events, or kinetic warfare, and the injuries suffered to themselves and the deaths of others, and on occasion, very unfortunately, it's caused by their own side. However, when I look at that, I pick apart the nature of the genre of memoirs, which precludes the forms of analysis which we would anticipate doing in critical military studies, and picking out things which would critically attend to phenomena of the military machine and militarism in society. These tend to be left out of military memoirs. It's not the nature of the genre to do so. Okay. So, and then I move into the specific example of the Falkland Islands, and an event in which I participated in and was able to analyze the specific account by a specific individual of a fratricide event, of which I was not a direct participant in, but my friends were, and I was alongside them, but not in that specific combat event. And to contrast the formal account of military history and with that of a critical military studies account. Okay, so I'm going to just wrap up there and to conclude. And to conclude, I'm just going to say that really what I'm saying in this paper is that critical veteran researchers have a unique adequacy which they can bring to the development of research of various kinds within critical military studies to allow a greater reflexive understanding of the phenomena which as individuals and as members of teams they can investigate and design adequate research methodology for. But key to this is that they have unique adequacy as both a critical military researcher and a veteran, not one or the other, but both. And that is the unique adequacy of the critical veteran researcher, is that they have both, and both are needed, or both are desirable. That doesn't mean that accounts of military cannot be produced, and militarism cannot be produced by people who don't have veteran researchers' unique adequacy. It just means that there is an enhancement if veteran researchers can bring their experience to the research party. That's it, thanks.
Thanks very much, Neil. Okay, so next up we have Ben Schrader, please.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I apologize if I've been yawning. It is 6 a.m. here in Colorado. But I am thankful for the invite and being able to be a part of this. This paper for me was always meant to be a book, and it still may become a book eventually. This idea of living war, writing war, teaching war, kind of a larger pedagogical experiment for me, right? It very much stems out of my getting out of the military in 2005, coming home from war, and yearning for more, right? To understand my experience, to understand the traumas that I had just went through while I was in Iraq, and to, just get it, right? Like make sense of it all, because at the time it didn't make any sense. I was very angry. And, I came back to school and I decided I wanted to study sociology to understand the human impacts of war, and political science to understand the gears of war. Unfortunately, an undergraduate degree in the United States only briefly flosses over the topic of war. Doesn't really go deep, and it wasn't until grad school that I actually was able to start engaging in some of these things that I really wanted to focus on. But before I get too far into that, I will say, like, it's really interesting because I came back to a climate that, at least in the US, that I know, was very rigid and almost afraid to talk about war, afraid to talk about militarism, right? And this was, obviously off the heels of this, never again will we treat veterans this way, that way, whatever. But we came back, and a lot of people didn't know how to talk about war. Like they were, like I said, they were afraid. And so it was, and for me, it was easy, right? But also the other climate around coming back was, there was a veterans office in our university, and it was very white, heteronormative, telling war stories, and just all the stuff that I didn't want to do. Like I wanted to understand my experience and talk about it, but I didn't want to glorify it in a lot of ways, which ironically, I actually run that office now in the same university, which I love. And we work hard to make it the most inclusive environment possible. It's really changed the culture. But so that was the kind of living portion of my paper. The writing war, it was one of those things. For me, it was very cathartic, right? To be able to write about my experience, and to, help process these things, which I think is a very valuable tool in exposing militarism, right? The value that we bring in writing. And one of the tools that really helped me on that path was Warrior Writers, right? Which is more around poetry, and just writing about your feelings, right? And so that was really the first step. And thankfully, I could say we're actually doing veteran writing workshops here in my current university, and we're getting ready to publish our second book of these veteran stories, right? And so it's a constant unpackaging, right, of our experiences, and being able to re-articulate the ways in which we understand and think and feel about war and militarism. But another thing within that kind of veteran writing, the Warrior Writers workshops, came this idea, and this came out of a conference, was autoarchaeology, right? Not quite autoethnography, because we're not in the moment writing about these things. And so I called it autoarchaeology because I was looking back at artifacts, right? I was looking back at pieces of writing. I was looking back at the gear I'd brought home, at the letters I wrote home, that maybe I didn't send, right? All these things helped me dig into my past and better understand what my experience was. And so that was one of the techniques that I really utilized for understanding war, that I talk about a little bit in this paper. Finally, I worked through all these things, not completely. I mean, we never fully worked through all these things, and I really appreciate some of the the presentations before about this kind of going back and forth between veteran, researcher, veteran, right? This code switching that constantly takes place. But you know, I get through all that. I get my degree. I get asked to come back to Colorado State University to teach a couple classes on my research and my work. And so I was able to put together classes that really deconstruct militarism, which, you know, the university still doesn't have as full-time courses. I'd love to make a veteran studies program here, even a critical military studies, right? Anything here where I'm at, but with time. But within these classes, these experimental classes I was able to teach, I was able to utilize a number of very different techniques for my classes. And I'll just go over one real quick since we're running out of time here. But my favorite was the gallery walk, right? So I would take pictures from veteran art, right? I would take pictures from activist art and put them up at different stations around the room, right? And have students get into small groups and go around to each of these pieces of art that is constructed by veterans, and just, what does this mean to you? What you know, what are you learning, right? And obviously we would do, you know, background, like watch a documentary on drones, right? But then you see this art that someone had constructed that, you know, depicts children afraid of drones, right? And you start seeing these little things, and it really hits students 1,000 times harder than reading any article we could write, you know. And then they have that conversation, and then we come back to the bigger circle and we have another conversation, right? I think that you know, trying to purvey what the trauma of war is to a student who, you know, just out of high school can be difficult, right? But I think that sometimes alternative methods of teaching is very valuable. And I think us as veteran researchers, we can see that. We can see when the light clicks, right? We can see when they're like, oh my gosh, I get it now, right? And, you know, I think that there's always something more, right? But at least it's a first step towards unraveling and better understanding the traumas of war, militarism, the traumas of militarism, right? That we all have to grapple with here in our work. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to questions later.
Thank you very much, Ben. So next up, we have Peter Lee, please.
Hi, everyone. Let's check my other screen. I am going to just talk for a few minutes about some of my own research. I contributed more personal reflection to the CMS special edition, rather than this being based on a paper that I'd written. Although ironically, the subject matter permeates everything that I've written and said and done for years. I just hadn't realized it until I started thinking about impacts on me and how my life has changed. I can relate to so much of what has been said already. The idea of being an insider and an outsider, because I was a military chaplain, and so a chaplain is never fully an insider. But we wear the uniform, and so I recognize some of those dynamics, of course, but not the gender aspect of it. And then some of the other things that chaplains deal with anytime something traumatic, whether it's a death, killing, in peacetime or wartime, chaplains tend to get involved in that. So I did that during my service, 2001 to 2008, and I left because I was deeply unwell. I didn't know at the time that it was because of the 5 months I had spent at the start of the Iraq War or Operation Telic in 2003, where I'd been a chaplain in a military hospital. And after a few years, the impacts of that made me unable to function as a chaplain and not even function very well as a human being. So I managed to move into academia, finish my PhD, and life just went on and life was good. And then some years later, 2016, 2018, I started researching with the Royal Air Force Reaper Force for a book not creatively entitled Reaper Force. And on my second day, I was watching a killing in real time of a Syrian jihadist. I had strange physiological phenomena happening. When that occurred, I remember there was a smell in the ground control station, which I later in the day identified as a smell of an amputated arm. It's a smell of burnt flesh and surgical chemicals from my first day in the military hospital in 2003. So 13 years later, I had this strange physical phenomenological sensation. I continued researching my book, and all the things that I try to avoid. The reason I left the chaplaincy to avoid dealing with other people's personal, I'll call it stuff, but we know I mean another word beginning with S. Suddenly I did 90 interviews, 90. I was just drowning in other people's trauma and getting more and more unwell. And so my reflection stems from that time in 2018 where I was unwell and eventually recognized there's something wrong. Tried to get help, saw a psychiatrist once, then he retired the next day. But I'd seen one, so I could tick that box. I've seen a psychiatrist. And then I wrote this reflection, and then I continued my research looking at moral injury in 2020, moral injury in Reaper crews and in police online child sex crime investigators. The common element being both the work is screen mediated. And by the end of that year, and that project in 2020, I was properly broken. I couldn't function, couldn't lead a meeting, couldn't attend a Zoom meeting. Got my line manager, my dean of the faculty, to refer me to occupational health, and then I spent half 2021 in therapy. So actually, from this article, my story continues because I went on, I continued to research in this area, but I had to ask the question, and professionals and colleagues have asked, can I and should I be researching in an area that is potentially continuing to re-traumatize me? And it's a fair question. Last year, 2022, I led a national mental health, well-being and moral injury survey of police child sex crime investigators. 1,000 respondents from every police force in the UK, including Scotland and Northern Ireland. And what I found is being a researcher in this area, given my past trauma, and once you've had a trauma, you're more susceptible to re-traumatizing, at least most people are, and I know I am. So what I found is actually I'm deeply driven to work in this area, to care for the people who do the hard things, whether it's military personnel, whether it's police, or in other contexts, which I'm expanding into. But I am getting better at looking after myself and other people. So, for example, I do more project management now and not the interviewing, which helps that I'm a professor. It helps that I have that option, that I can create a project in such a way. So that is useful. I also see harm in others. I see it happening, and so things that have come out of, followed on from this reflection that was published is in my own school, which of criminology and criminal justice. I'm now with the dean of faculty and head of school setting up a support system and structure for people across every field who research in potentially traumatizing areas. There are people who work with child sex abusers. There are people who work on the dark web. There are those who work with prison officers, police officers in my school, and there is a great deal of trauma and research around. I, with two other colleagues, created a presentation on exactly this, how you look after yourself as a researcher in the hard places. Preparation, knowing yourself, putting support structures in place, research ethics, the whole package. We created something for our grad school, and it's now part of our graduate school annual program that twice in person and twice online we talk about, not just for military people, but veterans, but people in every field. It just happens that this came rooted in my military experience. And prior to this, an hour ago, I was speaking to another university who heard about that and want me to go and talk about how their researchers look after themselves. So this reflection for me was partly a snapshot in time. It was slightly optimistic because I still had a bit further to go downwards after I wrote it. But I think it still says something to me. I think it's still relevant to researchers and how those of us who've been affected or been around trauma, how we live with it as academics, how we engage with it positively, because there can be post-traumatic growth as well. It's not just harm, and it has been quite of all the things I've ever written, and it's very small and it's a self-reflection, it's been, I think, significantly impactful on me and quite a number of others. So Hannah, I'm very glad you asked me. Thank you. That's all I have for now.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, and finally, we're going to come to Paul Highgate, please.
Hi, everybody, and apologies for the brain fog at the beginning of this. Yeah, so I mean, I wanted to sort of open really with a couple of reflections on, you know, the privilege, in a sense, I suppose, is what I'm thinking of, being able to talk as a veteran. In other words, I was thinking about this in relation to a paper published, if you haven't seen it, by Rachel Massey and Tom Timon, called Remaining in Between the Divides: Conceptual, Methodological and Ethical Political Dilemmas of Engaged Research in Critical Military Studies, which appeared in Critical Studies and Security recently. Now, it's a very provocative and somewhat controversial paper amongst the CMS community for various reasons. But one thing it did make me think of is, you know, we don't hear the voices of those affected by war in quite the same way, if at all. In fact, they are generally elided in the spaces that we work in, that we teach in, etc. So something like the project that some of you may be aware of, Living Under Drones, I think it's a Stanford thing. They actually go and interview people who have to live under drones, quite literally. And you get a completely different kind of perspective on what war and conflict looks like for those affected directly by it, and not veterans in this sense. So I wanted really to preface what I was going to say about, you know, about positionality as veterans. It's a privileged position in a sense, and one I think we probably need to reflect on, and also to contextualize more broadly within the kind of remit of a much wider set of critiques that have begun to appear, not least the Massey and Timon paper, but in security studies more generally. So I'm thinking, if you're aware of the paper by Ali Howell, Forget Militarization, which then brings us to a much bigger set of questions around liberalism and around the violence inherent to liberal states and liberal settlements, and how we position ourselves potentially not just in regard to the military, but in regard to the overall kind of context within which we've actually served. So all of that really is a way of saying, you know, in a sense, my journey began as a, you know, young person, obviously, who then enlisted into the RAF in 1983, left in 1991. So I was thinking that's 32 years ago. It's a long time ago. And I feel as if in many ways I've kind of stopped being a veteran. I don't know what quite that looks like, but it just feels as if I've probably been right through and come out the other side. However, what's very interesting at the same time is it, and I think Ben might have said it, but probably more than Ben, you know, it is extremely difficult to actually leave it all behind, not least my involvement in work of this kind. So, one of the kind of key stimulations, I think, to writing this paper was kind of the viscerality of pride, as you are kind of inculcated with it through the military, through, in my case, the Royal Air Force. So the sense of fulfillment, excitement, a connection, belonging, all of these things that kind of anchor you in a world of kind of profound ontological security. They're still very recent memories in a sense. I can still really feel what that's like on a passing out parade day. There's a fly past and you're there, and it's profound, and I'm sure it affects people in different ways. But I do remember thinking or feeling, I suppose, at that point, you know, something had happened in my life which was like could never be changed. And in a way, this paper, just to depress everybody, I suppose, is a reflection on the fact that actually, when I really think about it, and as this journey has progressed to the point at which I am now, I'm really sad and disappointed that I don't feel like that anymore. And the reasons for that are political reasons, not least through doing sociology as a mature student while still serving in RAF. And many light bulbs were flashing at that point and made me realize that I'd kind of fallen into a trap set for me by an institution, and not just the institution itself, but having a background, my family's background in the RAF as well. So I was this kind of subject, waiting, keen, open to being socialized in this very particular kind of way, where pride was at its core. And so that really does inform the paper and the kind of reflections on, you know, how productive pride is, not just for those serving in terms of getting them to do what you want them to do and creating a certain kind of self, but more than that, in the ways that pride legitimizes a wider set of rationales for, you know, military spending or military intervention or whatever it might be, is to exceptionalize the serviceman or woman in ways that elevate them beyond the civilian actor. So we were always kind of told, and it's kind of floating around in the ether, if you like, that we as military people, I mean, historically in this case, but are better somehow, are superior than our civilian, the civilian demographic. Now, I challenge that fundamentally, and slight mix-up on my part. I apologise. The paper I'm writing is going to deal with some of these issues. But the point really here is, you know, to draw out from an autoethnographic perspective the work that Pride has done in legitimating the armed forces, but also the ways in which it works through military selves in very particular kinds of ways. Now, this may or may not be quite a personal story. There may be some kind of resonance with other, you know, people I presented, other of us so-called veterans, and there may not. But I can certainly say that, you know, going back to that 17-year-old stood in the parade square, you know, that feeling, I'm sure, was something that was experienced by many in that context. What happened to that after you know, during the interim years remains to be seen, I guess. So I start off really by talking about, you know, this kind of much more autoethnographic perspective before moving on really to show the productive work, you know, for example, in things like opinion polls, public opinion polls, and such, that the armed forces are extremely popular, and their people, our boys and girls, are extremely popular amongst the wider public. And as I say, are exceptionalized for the sacrifices they have made for the country. I was going to say for Queen and country, but for King and country, looking forward. One of the kind of key moments, I suppose, was being in a room, and as I document in the paper, being in a room of veterans where people started to talk about their military service in terms of the pride that it had given them, and still, in a sense, they experienced, and how I felt very much kind of alienated in that context. I did reflect at that point and thought, well, I'm not proud, because once I learned about what the armed forces were about, where they've come from, you know, the issues around the politics of the armed forces, I changed my view. And I went through the process, as I said, from a PhD looking at homelessness amongst rough sleepers who'd served in the army principally, through to writing in a more kind of problem-solving sense, a more liberal reformist sense for Armed Forces and Society Journal, through to where I am now, which in a sense is not, I'm not keen on the term anti-military, it just sounds too jarring, but maybe non-military is something, a non-military imaginary is something I've begun to adopt and think about more broadly. So one of the things I talk about here, I mean, obviously, it's, you know, quite a bit of detail in the paper with regards to how military pride is made, that's created, how military selves are crafted in this particular kind of way, which involves body and mind. It's an embodied experience as much as it is a more psychological kind of collective experience. Incredibly powerful to have often people from, in my context at least, from relatively poor backgrounds coming into an institution. Perhaps they'd failed at school and suddenly they were in a context where through a few weeks of learning, they were able to achieve things that they hadn't thought they could. And where, of course, they had been, you know, relatively dehumanized in the initial stages and then built up into these different kinds of individuals with confidence, with belief, and all of the kinds of things that we are aware of, with pride, as I say, being at the core of the kind of project. Then I discuss how, unlike Sophie, I was actually flying a desk, not flying a real plane, as a clerk, as an administrator, what it's possible for me to say as a particular kind of ground truth, if you like. And one of the things that struck me actually is many years ago, I edited a book called Military Masculinities. And one of the contributors, who shall be named, Rachel Woodward, wrote a chapter about military training in the kind of rural setting and how relevant that the outdoors is to you know, training of that kind. When I read the chapter, I had assumed that she had served. It was so insightful and it captured the kind of idiosyncrasies that you perhaps wouldn't imagine a civilian might have insights into. And I thought, well, that's interesting when I found out after. It shows, I think, that the ground truth thing is also something which we might want to reflect on more critically. And I know Neil has a particular view on that, but I thought it was very interesting actually that you can, in fact, create a situation where, you know, your insight, perhaps your imaginary, if you like, can be put to use, put to work in constructing, you know, a reality which, you know, some might believe has come from that ground truth, but in that case, yeah. Okay, so it's a very kind of autobiographical paper. One of the things I tried to do in it is kind of deconstruct the exceptional military body. So sorry for all the noise outside, but if you can hear that. One of the things that the armed forces are known for is the fitness of their people and the intense and kind of protracted training regimes, which create extremely fit individuals. Now, I suppose, I'm not sure how much it has changed, but from my understanding, it hasn't changed too much. Enlistment into the Royal Air Force, at least, doesn't require profound levels of, you know, fantastic fitness. It requires you to be fit and healthy in certain ways, but obviously, with the time I went through basic training of only 6 weeks, it's a very short period of basic training compared to the other armed forces. And I think, you know, what was required of us in those few weeks in terms of the physicality was actually not something out with many young people at that time. You know, and so in a sense, exceptionalizing individuals going through that context perhaps does miss the kind of reality of the situation where, in a sense, the RAF, the Army, the Navy, the Special Forces, perhaps less so, but in a sense, are all conflated. So we have this imaginary of the military body as being kind of almost like a super body. But so that was one of the first myths, I suppose, to be deconstructed in the paper as a way to say, well, why should we be so proud of this so-called exceptional individual when actually they haven't done a great deal? I mean, you know, they've been down the gym quite a lot and they've been shouted at quite a lot, but their physical fitness is not necessarily something which is exceptional. I'll then move on to talk a little bit about my role, that sounds a bit lofty, but my experience of being in so-called First Gulf War, as working in the intelligence cells, providing RAF Tornado aircrew with maps, targets that they would then go on to bomb in Q8. And and when I look back, and I mean, to be kind of critical in a sense is, well, what was that war all about? In a sense, you could take a step back and say, well, this is about geopolitics, this is about oil, this is about a military capitalist intervention, of course. In my thinking, that's how I would read this situation. You may disagree, of course, and that's something we can talk about. So
really
again,
sorry to Paul, really sorry to be that guy, but would you mind wrapping up so that we can get to the questions? We got just want to make sure that we leave enough time. Thank you.
So to wrap up, I mean, obviously, if you are so inclined, you can read the paper. I really do put military pride on the kind of, I subject it to a very kind of profound scrutiny, and I talk about race there, and I talk about bullying, and I talk about gender, and all the things that we're kind of aware of in terms of the armed forces and recent reports and the record. So in light of that, sorry for going over, I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. Okay, so we have 20 minutes remaining for questions. So I'm going to throw it open to the audience at this point. So I'm going to keep an eye on the, if anyone has a question, please just raise your hand and then unmute yourself and ask. Sarah is going to keep an eye on the chat and read things out from there if there's anything that's come in while the speakers were going as well. So does anyone like to start us off?
I'll start us off with a comment rather than a question, and it's just to all the other presenters that I wish I'd had this insight years ago to look at, to learn from, and I've learned things from every one of you just now, and really appreciated that. So I do hope that those of us who've contributed to this special edition, that perhaps it will provide a bit of a support route map, or even just a sense of you are not alone for new military personnel or veterans coming to the research. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. I can see Neil waving a hand.
Yeah, I'm live there. Okay, so yeah, I think there's a few interesting questions which we can raise here. Just follow on for a little bit from what Paul has said. I mean, who constitutes a veteran? What is the, why are veterans special? And what is the social political nature of being a veteran, and how has that changed over time? These are all pertinent issues for when we think about what it is as a veteran researcher. Because of course when you think about, for example, the family members as being veterans by association, and especially having almost served, and I say almost meaning they have served, often wives and husbands in military environments or military bases, part of the military family, as it were. And so there is this, what constitutes being a veteran, what knowledge people will have of being a veteran, how they relate to each other as being a veteran. There's a very diverse spectrum, of which I think, as Paul alludes to, is that it gets narrowed down into this version of the veteran as a guy who might, usually a guy, marching up and down near a monument, saluting a bit and doing some stuff as it's been projected by the military through the militarization of the veteran at the current time. And I think one of the things is that as veterans doing research, and which was mentioned by other speakers, is that we have to deal with that version of the veteran when doing research into critical military studies as veterans, as it is a very strong stereotype of what constitutes a veteran. And I just thought I'd throw that in case anybody has any ideas about, that notion of dealing with that veteran as a research and being a researcher as a veteran from that spectrum.
Thanks, Neil. I can see there's a hand going up from Circa Is that probably a bit of a
Circe.
mispronounced?
Circe. Hi, I'm Circe. I'm the founder of the Museum of the American Military Family in New Mexico. And I was listening, and I'm not a researcher, but we have prided ourselves on trying to get as many perspectives of many things over the years through our books. And we published one last year called E Pluribus Unum, and it is Grace Under Pressure, Gender, Religion, Race, Identity, Culture, and Ethnicity in the Military Family. And what we did is we sent out a survey with open-ended questions trying to get stories. And we sent them out to anybody, and family members and children and parents and all of that. And we received a lot of different data, but I am not a researcher. So we hired some anthropologists to sort through all the data, and they were not military affiliated. Somebody was talking about that. And they came to this very neutral conclusion that there is no stereotypical veteran, because we're a cross section of all walks of society, at least in the United States. And our museum has always said, you know, you're not going to understand history, military history, unless you get perspectives from the spouses, from the families, or the kids, because they do serve too. And I liked that that you said, because it's so true. And I just, sorry to insert myself, but I'm excited about it. I've loved every presentation so far, and I will shut up now.
No, thank you very much indeed for that. I'm just going to come to Sarah, because I think you mentioned there was some comments and questions in the chat.
Yeah, there's some interesting ones. I'm going to try and group some together, and maybe we can hear reflections from people on them. So there's one from Mike Almond, which is about whether being in the military and certain, you know, doing degrees at work or at staff college actually prevents you from being critical, and so you can't really do this kind of work until you've left and you have become a veteran. You can't do that kind of critical work. And also ask the question about what about reservists, and how would they sit, and how would their experiences be affected in this? Heloise Gidley has asked about whether being a veteran researcher has a shelf life, in the sense that the military evolves over time, and how relevant is your experience? And then there's another one, I mean, there's quite a few, but there's another one I thought would be good to get people's reflections on, and that is from Tara Zamet, which is, what advice would you offer to non-military early career researchers who are trying to engage with veteran communities? And are there any common mistakes that you see? Yeah, so there's those sort of three areas, if you guys might want to respond to those.
Okay, I see a hand up from Sophie first. I'm going to come to you, please.
Yeah, I might not answer all of them because I'll let other people come in, and I don't want to take up too much time. I think it's really interesting about the question about degrees while you're in the military, degrees at work. And I'll just offer this because this is anecdotal and it's not any more than that. But I have mentored specifically one PhD student who was in the military and worked alongside several others. And so I'm just talking at the PhD level because I think it's more applicable there. All of the ones that I've worked with, and I don't think this is down to me, decided to leave service at some point, either during or not long after they finished their PhD. So I think that's interesting. I just offered that out. And on the question about how do you feel non-veteran ECRs and researchers should navigate, you know, hope to engage with veteran communities, are there common mistakes, that kind of thing. The first one is, please don't apologize for being non-military, because I have such high regard for colleagues who are non-military, who are researching in similar areas to me. Yes, there are certain different perspectives, but that's what makes it so good, that there are different perspectives. So I think I often, you know, offer to have a chat with somebody or whatever, and they will start the conversation. And I know I don't know what it's like to be in the military. Well, that's a good thing. It's not something to apologize for. I'll leave it there and let the others come in.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm just going to go to the hands as in the order that I see them coming up on the screen here. So that was Hannah and then Ben.
Super, thanks, Nick. Yeah, I just wanted to come in on Heloise's question actually about the veterans' sort of shelf life. I think I was thinking about this during the other presentations, and I think for me, you know, I'll always be ex-military, although noting what Paul says about coming out of the other side, I don't think I'm there yet. So that's how it feels at the moment. And so I think it's always going to have an impact on my research, whatever the research is about. But obviously, you know, there's areas of research you could be in that to which it would seem, you know, much less relevant. But I think the issue the question's getting at is if the research is about something, some characteristic or part of the military which you do feel, you know, changes over time, and where relevance perhaps is a bigger factor. And I think for me, that's where like the research design and the methodology and things come in, because I think if your experience is directly informing the research in the sense of it's a direct kind of data source to it, then there's an argument to say that there could be some aspects of the military that you're researching where that could be out of date. But then arguably, of course, you could be doing a historical study or something that spans a period of time, and then it still may maintain its relevance. But I think there's a separate thing if you're also just reflecting on your positionality and how your, you know, what your relationship is with the thing that you're researching. So even if it is, you know, I'm just looking to bring my own research up to more contemporary settings, looking at contemporary military cultures. So obviously I left now some time ago. So however, I'm bringing kind of historical study and findings with me into those contemporary settings. So I feel like that relevance is, you know, is still applicable whilst maintaining an awareness that my own positionality is, you know, fixed in a particular period of time, and just being aware of that in the conversations that I have. Like I have some relevance in that conversation as I interview people, but also aware that, you know, 10 years might have passed, and so there will be some changes also to reflect on. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question.
Thanks so much, Hannah. So Ben, please, and then Neil, and then Paul.
Yeah, so many interesting aspects, and so many people have already brought up a lot of these. You know, and this is all anecdotal as well. I think one of the great points though that was brought up is that there's no uniform veteran, right? And that, but I think what makes so many of us unique right here is that critical lens. And I think that within, this is even kind of in some mistakes that some people make, is that idea that there's a uniform veteran. But I think one of the things that really shifts the ways in which we think when we start using a critical lens, because I've seen veteran researchers who do not use a critical lens, who then have this uniform idea of the veteran, right? And it's just like, it kind of shocks me and blows my mind that they're like, you know, again, this is anecdotal, but they're like, you know, oh yeah, you get it, you're a vet, right? And it's like, yeah, but I don't see it the same way you do, right? And that's because of that critical lens. So I think that's the most important aspect of it. And I think that any researcher who's got the critical lens will be able to understand the positionality better, right, than someone who may not have that critical lens. So
thanks, Ben. Neil.
Yeah, I just sort of add to that, and I'm just going to take it the other way around and say that, you know, that there isn't a boundary between the military and the civilian. Like, we live in militarized societies. Everybody is militarized, and we're just degrees of militarization, and we're associated with other militarized aspects of life around us. From video games to news reports to forms of embodied activity in social spaces, the monitoring of our behavior, everything about us is militarized. So scrap the binary, and it annoys me a lot, so I won't stick with that. As a researcher though, what it is it's all about how you design your research project. You know, the question is not whether you've been in the military or you have or you haven't, because as I said, different people from different aspects of the military have different experiences, and so there isn't a uniform. Forgive the pun. You know, a singular military experience which you have or haven't got, that doesn't exist. And so when you're researching things which are military and militarized, first of all, they're not purely in the military, out the military necessarily. And also the practices which you're investigating are not necessarily purely militarized, but often 95% of generic across society as a whole, and only small aspects of them are militarized. So the question is when you're going to research a phenomenon, you need to ask astute questions about what it is you know and don't know about the phenomena. And then the question is how do you use the research methods which are available and the people available, or whatever methodology you're trying to use, to overcome limitations that you might have in, and what you can reasonably ask, and what types of research you can do. So it's, for me, it's research design, and being reflexive about who and what you are and what you know informs your research design process. And that is key to undertaking any pieces of research, because otherwise you can waste your time when you get your analysis, your data. You might find that the analytical capacity to undertake that research has just been is not as good as it could have been with some reflexive analysis on the methodology.
Thank you, Neil. Paul. Oh, Paul, you're muted.
Sorry, apologies. So my question really is to try and think a bit more about putting the politics into what it is we're doing. Which kind of seems to me to have been, it's kind of there, but we need to really name it. And I think, my question is, what is the aim of our research? What are we trying to achieve ultimately, number one? And number two, shouldn't we be trying to demilitarize? I mean, isn't that what it's all about? I mean, because a lot of the stuff that's going on is based on a liberal reform agenda, which is about enhancing the effectiveness or fairness of the military, and in that way, the status quo remains unchanged. And I think is given what's going on in the world, and lots of broader questions which we may or may not touch on. Maybe it's a personal thing. I think we should be looking at the military and saying, how can we spend less on the military? What can we do to affect that kind of thing, and not be involved in the old Cynthia Enloe thing being militarized? So that would be my kind of point.
Thanks, Deep Paul. Okay, I'm just going to come back to the floor to see if there are any other hands going up. And if not, Sarah, is there anything else we need to come back to from the chat? We've probably got time for one more question to squeeze in.
There's one that Karen B has raised, which I think is quite interesting, and it kind of links to what Paul has just raised, actually, around how you do that, how you negotiate these various kind of tensions and do this work. So Karen B has said, does anyone have any insights or comments on how, as a community, veteran researchers could best identify and rectify their various possible forms of competing interests or conflict of interests? So how do you marry up these different things, especially if you're still serving or you're a reservist and yet you want to have a critical perspective? Is that even possible? But also, what if you are on a board or volunteering on a particular kind of military affiliated kind of organization and you want to bring those critical insights, but then you are part of that, as Paul has just said, that kind of, are you being militarized by doing that? Is the answer just to disengage? Sorry, that's me ad-libbing, that's not Karen B. But I think it's an interesting question. It applies, I think, as much, not just for veterans, but also for all of us who are doing this kind of closer, engaged work. Any thoughts on that?
Great, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Karen, as well. It's a really in-depth and insightful question. We've got only a few minutes left, so can I ask for final concluding comments on this question from each of our speakers, please? You have a minute each. Who would like to start?
So I'll go. I didn't quite catch the whole question. So one of the issues about this is evidential base. Right now, if you're going to change things and you're going to have things changed, we live in a society where, to a certain extent, you need evidence to swing people's opinions, no matter who they are. And that evidence has to be robust. Yeah. So while we could be utopian about what sort of world we want to live in and why we it should look like this or look like that and be the other, and this is good and this is bad, without some evidential basis to persuade others and to give an evidence for decision-making activities, which will then affect policy issues. We can say what we want, but we have to have some robust evidence. And the question is, and I can't give an answer for that, what constitutes the robust evidence? Because the robust evidence changes from decision-making situation to decision-making situation. So it's a very complex environment by which we do our research in, because we have to understand where the evidence which we produce for whatever aspect we're investigating is going to be used in policy and for the potential to change things.
Great, thank you, Neil. Paul, was that a hand?
Sorry, it was a hand. Yeah. So if I can just jump in there very quickly. I mean, I think we need to be very clear about this. I think, yes, Neil, evidence, but this is about ideology. I mean, you only have to go to the Alternative Security Review to have a good critique of strategic defence reviews over the years. Okay, this is choosing evidence on an ideological basis. Evidence is not, as we know, a kind of neutral thing. It is co-opted. It is used ideologically. So I would say that.
Thanks, Paul. Sophie, any concluding comments?
Yeah, and I just want to address something Paul had put in the chat earlier about if the politics of serving is serving apolitical, and to be completely crystal clear, there's nothing apolitical. Although one isn't allowed to, if they're in the military, you can join a political party, but you can't do anything in party political terms. I think the very act of choosing to join and remaining is a political act. And there are lots of people I know in complete denial about that in the military who say they are completely apolitical, and I disagree with them.
Great, thank you, Sophie. Ben, any concluding comments?
Yeah, sure. Like I feel like here in the US, there still is a fear of speaking critically against the military and militarism. Especially because the DoD still funds so much research at so many universities, right? And so, and even my own job, while I'm not doing research anymore, I have to cater to a wide variety of political views, right? I have to deal with donors, right? I have to do all these things. So what do? Right? Like, how do I go to sleep at night, right? Well, I try to hold people accountable for when they are being, not inclusive, when they are not upholding these values that I believe critically make the world better, right? I think that I try to bring in as many of those voices that we don't hear, right? Bring in the voices of those who are subjugated, right? And by doing that, I think it gives voice to those who may not have ever heard, these aspects of life. So, I think it's just important to bring in as many voices as possible, because I think that's how you fight the power in some ways.
Wonderful, thanks, Ben. Okay, and final concluding comments, please, from Hannah.
Yeah, don't worry, I'll keep it super brief. But thanks, everyone. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I think for me, as a sort of final point, for me, it's all about the sort of knowledge exchange and the keeping the conversation open. And I think there's many aspects to that. One is great to see everyone here today and to carry on the conversation that the special issues started. But for me as well, it's about continuing that conversation with the MOD, with the wider military community, with the wider public community, and not being afraid to be radical in the conversations. I think it's often assumed that we, that if it's going to be a conversation that is with the MOD or the military, that therefore it is constrained in some way to a particular kind of agenda. And I think we need to reshape and rethink how radical we want to be and can be in those conversations. Anyway, yeah, I'll stop there, but thanks a lot, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Hannah. And thank you everyone for turning up today to witness our speakers. I'd just like to thank all our attendees and speakers for a really interesting discussion there. And hopefully you all now have plenty of incentive to go away and read the special issue if you haven't done so already. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. But thank you so much, everyone, for this afternoon. That's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, bye.
Bye. Thank you.